Mr. Rybuck, when you're ready, you may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. My name is Corey Rybuck. I've served as General Manager for Manitoba Egg Farmers over the past 10 and a half years, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to present to you this evening. Manitoba Egg Farmers represents 170 regulated egg and pullet farmers in our province. MEF is an independent organization funded entirely by egg and pullet producers. Regulated farmers are the primary caregivers of hens that produce over 76 million dozens each year in Manitoba and feeding communities all across this province. Manitoba Egg Farmers fully supports the adoption of Bill 62, the proposed Animal Diseases Amendment Act. Bill 62 would require a person to obtain the consent of the owner before entering a biosecurity zone, such as a laying hen or pullet barn, or interacting with animals to limit the spread of disease. A biosecurity zone is an area within a livestock operation to which access is tightly controlled to limit the spread of pathogens. The threat of biosecurity breaches, which can sicken and kill hens and compromise the safety of our food system, is real when unauthorized people enter on egg farmers' premises. Our egg and pullet farmers take measures every day to protect their flocks. Bill 62 represents an additional measure to limit the spread of disease. Regulated egg and pullet farmers across Canada adhere to the National Start Clean, Stay Clean on-farm food safety program. The objective of this national mandatory program is to produce safe eggs for consumption by utilizing good management practices and operating procedures that effectively prevent or control identified biological, chemical, and physical hazards. Start Clean, Stay Clean is a HACCP-based program. Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, or HACCP, is a systematic approach to food safety that is internationally recognized and recommended by the Codex Alimentarius Commission, a joint food and agriculture organization, and World Health Organization food standards program established in the early 1960s to protect consumer health and promote fair practices in food trade. Originally, about 25 years ago, the Start Clean, Stay Clean program was developed as a control for Salmonella enteritidis, as outbreaks of salmonellosis, the human disease caused by Salmonella bacteria, had seriously disrupted the egg industry in much of Europe and the United States. Even though Canada's record with Salmonella enteritidis was among the best in the world, the Canadian egg industry felt it could contribute to the improvements being made worldwide. Environmental swabs looking for Salmonella enteritidis are regularly taken each egg layer flock cycle and in the pullet barn as well. As the Start Clean, Stay Clean program matured, the industry came to realize that the same practices that combat Salmonella enteritidis could also control other organisms that can cause foodborne illness or poultry disease, such as ILT, a lethal respiratory disease, which is a common occurrence in backyard flocks in Manitoba. Salmonella enteritidis being controlled is not the only true goal of any good management practice, which really is the control of all food safety hazards and health threats to the hens. The Start Clean, Stay Clean program is a dynamic one and is updated as the body of knowledge changes through experience, research, technical advancements, and government regulation. This constant development maintains the strength of the program and assists the Canadian egg industry in continually meeting the high standards for food safety, egg quality, and animal health. On-farm inspections are conducted by trained third-party professionals to verify the operations against the Start Clean, Stay Clean program and to ensure that requirements are met consistently. It is the farmer's responsibility to implement the Start Clean, Stay Clean standards on farm, keep records to demonstrate this conformance, undergo evaluations and audits, and take immediate actions as necessary to correct any shortcomings. All of a farmer's daily efforts to maintain the safety of the eggs produced and the health of a flock are jeopardized by the unauthorized and careless breaches of the biosecurity zones in their barns. It is for this reason that MEF fully supports the adoption of Bill 62. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Rybuck. The Honourable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Corey, for your presentation. I certainly appreciate the information that you've given to this committee tonight, and I have no further questions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rybuck, for your presentation. Just curious to know your thoughts about improving the biosecurity protocol compliance by the employees at the poultry farms. Any thoughts on that?
Mr. Rybuck?
Certainly that's something that we do take seriously, and we help our farmers, whether they're colony producers or farmers with newer, younger employees. We offer training to bring them up to speed on the biosecurity requirements of the national program. We have an extension person full-time on staff. So we make every effort to, because the program is dynamic, we're always updating our farmers as to the requirements so that they can meet them consistently.
Mr. Brar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Follow-up question. I've seen a few studies where it's indicated that there are some protocols which are not being followed by the employees at various facilities in Canada, maybe due to lack of training or lack of resources. Do you think Manitoba needs more resources in education, training, and public extension to improve this part of our industry?
Mr. Rybuck?
I can only address that question in an egg context. Again, I know we're fortunate in that being funded by egg and pullet farmers and the priority that they put on on-farm programming, we are able to deliver those services to our farms and new employees. Again, we're always looking for ways to improve that, and certainly COVID has had us, pivot like everybody else has to deliver these programs, virtually and online. So we're making every effort to make sure that, again, those breaches don't happen as a result of untrained workers.
The Honourable Mr. Gerard.
Thank you, Corey. Much appreciate your presentation. One of the questions which has come up earlier on is what is included in a biosecurity zone for example, a poultry, an egg barn.
Mr. Rybuck.
Yeah, so I can speak to, again, my experience in barns. I haven't been in everyone, obviously, but typically, and my colleague who'll be following my presentation can speak in more detail at the farm level. But typically when you pull up to a farm, you park away in a marked zone, you change your boot covers, put on a disposable smock, and there's areas marked out within the barn that you wait to make other, again, footwear changes before you actually enter the production area. The restricted access zone or biosecurity zone is clearly marked within each facility.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any further questions for Mr. Rybuck? Seeing no further questions, we thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Rybuck, and we will now move on to the next presenter. I will now call on Kurt Siemens, Siemens Farms Limited, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
Hi there.
Mr. Siemens, you may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank everybody for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you tonight. It is 9:30 already. It's getting late, so I'm not going to try to ramble on too much here. I'm a third-generation egg farmer out in south of Winnipeg, about 45 minutes. We have egg layers and pullets on our farm. And I'm going to speak to you today a little bit about Bill 62. And from what I understand, it's about strengthening the laws to maintain biosecurities on farm and animal production sites. I'm going to speak in favor of this amendment. And the reason I say that is it is something to enhance the biosecurity in our farms. On our farms, we follow very strict biosecurity protocols. We have our driveways, at the end of our driveways, marked with signs. So even people that are driving by can understand the importance of biosecurity and understand that this site that they potentially would want to enter is under a biosecurity protocol and something that they'd have to be careful for. So if there's, as Corey mentioned before, if there's also a vehicle or somebody that's been invited to our farm, they enter our premises and they must park at least 50 feet away from any production facilities or any air intake from a production facility. All our doors are locked and they all have signs on them that only authorized personnel should enter. And all our main entrances, we have cameras over top of them, and those cameras are set to record when there's movement. And that is just to track if anybody shows up at the farm that we didn't give consent to. We have that recording. We know who's on site, and we have cameras to see what's going on. Once the visitor has received consent and authority to enter the facility, they would do so with one of the owners or one of our employees. And once they're inside, they immediately, as Corey said, they have to change their footwear or put coverings over their footwear. Then each visitor to our farm needs to sign a visitor log. And in that visitor log, they agree to not handle the birds, or if they are going to handle the birds, they have to do it with the consent of the owner or the employee. And plus, if they also see something that they don't find is an irregularity or something that they don't agree with or something like that, they are to let the people know immediately. So that's something they read and sign as soon as they come in the door. After that, once they are moved into the barn or into the production facility, if they actually want to be in with the live animals, with the live birds, they do have to have full coveralls on, mask and gloves as required. And then once they're all done, all these disposable shoe coverings and coveralls and masks and everything, they have to be disposed of in the garbage that's provided. So somebody might ask, like, okay, so why all this biosecurity? Like, why so much biosecurity? And the reason is because we care for our birds and the livestock that we have. We very much take it to heart how much that means to us to keep those birds or those hens in our farms biosecure. We don't want them to have diseases or have bacterias or viruses come into the farms. We hear from other areas in the world like Russia or some of the Asian countries where avian influenza keeps on coming back and they have a hard time getting rid of it. And Canada can be very, very proud. Canada and Manitoba can be very, very proud as egg farmers, at least, that we have some really strong and stringent biosecurity. And the visitors also ask, like, why do I have to put all this stuff on? And we tell them, you have to follow the biosecurity protocols. It's not to protect the visitor from the birds. It's to protect the birds from the visitor. So that's the important part. That's the part that we're trying to protect. As Corey also mentioned, the presenter just before me, he talked about Start Clean, Stay Clean. It's a program that we have that's part of our biosecurity and food safety program that we have in Canada and in Manitoba. It's been accredited by CFIA. And on our farm, most farmers get inspected annually, but because we have three separate barns in our site, we would be probably more like 2 or 3 times a year where we would, and every so often they will send in a third-party inspector just to make sure that we have full compliance with our biosecurity protocols. On our farm, we take care of birds from day one till they are at least 72 weeks old. So we have a lot invested in our birds, and the care of those birds for us is paramount. I think this Bill 62 is an improvement, or the amendments will be an improvement to benefit all egg farmers. I'd find it very difficult if somebody broke the law or intentionally broke our protocols to illegally enter our barns. I personally, I don't know what I would do. I'm speaking as a farmer here, and I want to be honest with you guys. I think it's something that would scare me. It would anger me. It would do a lot to me. But I think with these increased amendments and these fines and I guess the opportunity for them to spend some time behind bars if they breach that, I'm hoping that would be something that would deter anybody it doesn't matter to who I'm talking about. If they break those protocols, there has to be some repercussion for breaking the law. And I would agree with that. And our farm is similar to what Bill and Cam has said before me, the presenters ahead of me. Our farm is not just a place to make a living. It's a place where we make a life. And about 2.5 years ago, my son has moved onto the farm. He lives on the site with his wife and their 2 daughters, my grandchildren. So it's very important to us to make sure that somebody doesn't illegally trespass, like Bill 63, I think it was, is another trespassing bill that's being amended. So that it means a lot to us that the government is looking forward to try and strengthen those bills to keep our family safe. Having grandchildren or my son and his wife on the farm there, it's comforting, I guess, to me or as farmers that those bills are definitely being improved and amended in a proper way. I think that's about all I have to speak to today, and I'll gladly answer any questions that I can.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Siemens. The Honorable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Kurt, for your presentation and certainly explaining the protocols that you have and the reasons behind your protocols that you have within your barns and on your yards. I think you've probably answered the Honorable Gerard's questions about biosecurity zones and how they're marked. And with that, Mr. Chair, I don't have any further questions.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Siemens, you made me nostalgic when you talk about your third generation and then your son and your grandson, so it makes fourth and fifth generation on the farm. And now I virtually went back at the piece of land where I was born. I'm thinking of my great-grandparents, and they've been farming since as long back as I can think of. So how have you witnessed biosecurity protocol breaches in the past 100 years at your farm? How did they progress? What was the scene then and now?
Mr. Siemens.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Barr. I'm not 100 years old, so I can't go that far back, but I'll go as far back as I can recall. I can remember when I started farming with my parents, with my mom and dad. Biosecurity wasn't much of anything back then, and we didn't know about the diseases that we know about now. So it has improved immensely. I know when Start Clean, Stay Clean came in the early 90s, we were lucky to get 60-70% on a Start Clean, Stay Clean at that point. Now our farm has been at 100% for the last 10 years. So it is something that we definitely take to heart. And I think, as Corey had mentioned too, the egg boards or the organizations that look after some of those rules and work with CFIA to develop them, they work really well with farmers to make sure biosecurity is intact. And I think there was even some funding from I guess Growing Forward 2, it would have been that we could do some work on our farms to increase our biosecurity. And I think a lot of the egg farmers took advantage of those opportunities and did some improvements to make sure that they had better rooms or better quarantine zones or strategic zones to let people in so you could have better biosecurity. So it's greatly improved, and we'll try our best to keep on making it better.
Mr. Brar.
Mr. Siemens, did you witness any particular incidents at your farm or any farm in Manitoba, egg farm in Manitoba, that you have witnessed and you think that was a serious breach of biosecurity in the recent past?
Mr. Siemens.
Thanks for that question. I can honestly say no, I haven't, not in Manitoba. As far as biosecurity, I do have a lot of friends and colleagues that lived through 2004 in British Columbia when they had the AI or avian influenza outbreak. That was disastrous. I had some friends that needed a lot of I guess, mental help after that because of what it did to them to depopulate their farms and go through that experience. And that is something I don't want to have happen. I'm not blaming the farmers that it happened because AI is very contagious. It transfers very easily. It doesn't take much. Anybody can transfer it. So it's the protocols around that are phenomenal. Actually, I've done some mock exercises with AI on our farm previously. I guess it must be about 8 years ago now, where we did a mock exercise in Manitoba, and my farm was the example that we used. And yeah, it's a lot of work, and that just made me think about, you know, biosecurity has to be perfect. Otherwise, you're going to have a situation like that, and that nobody wants to live through.
The Honourable Mr. Gerard.
Yeah, thank you, Kurt, for your presentation, informative. Would you say that compared with 10 or 20 years ago that there's a much greater need for biosecurity now?
Mr. Siemens.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gerard. A greater need, yes. There's always a greater need. Food safety. I mean, I don't want to sell my product to consumers like you and not be totally confident that I'm giving you the best that I can give you. So we got to keep on improving to try and make it the best that we can. I think we're doing a really good job. We're doing a great job with biosecurity. So to have somebody come in now and there's no real legal ramifications for breaking that biosecurity, that's unthinkable. I mean, I don't like thinking about that. So
Mr. Siemens, sorry to interrupt, but
Sorry.
unfortunately time for questions has expired. We thank you very much for your presentation, but we will have to move on to another presenter. I will now call on Andrew Dixon, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Mr. Dixon, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much. You may proceed with your presentation whenever you're ready, Mr. Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank you and the members of the committee tonight for this opportunity to present my opinions on Bill 3262, which presents a set of amendments to the Animal Diseases Act. I speak as a private citizen, having retired in January of this year as General Manager of the Manitoba Pork Council after 16 years. And prior to that, it's 30 years as a civil servant with Manitoba Agriculture. I've had extensive experience of working with farmers to manage disease outbreaks, as well as hands-on experience as a farm worker on both small and large farms. To be clear, I am fully supportive of the proposed amendments. Our farmers need these legal measures to ensure that all of their efforts to protect their operations from diseases will not be rendered useless by the unlawful entry of uninvited persons in their vehicles carrying the threat of disease from sources unknown. I'll limit my comments to my experience in the pork sector, but I'm sure they'll be applicable to other species. You've already heard from others in the sector, so hopefully I won't be too repetitive. As background, the livestock industry in Manitoba produces about $2.4 billion in farm gate income, and hogs account for just about $1 billion of those receipts. These farm sales then drive a thriving processing and distribution business, which ripples into the rest of the Manitoba economy. The pork sector itself generates something like 14,000 jobs, creating wealth to support all of Manitoba. Most of our livestock products are exported. Over 90% of our pork is exported to other provinces and countries around the world. Every day, livestock producers have to contend with the challenges of raising and caring for their animals, predict the ever-changing marketplace, and manage their farms to be profitable. For livestock producers, diseases present possibly the biggest threat of potentially wiping out their entire operation. Just because African swine fever has not been found on a farm in North America doesn't mean it couldn't come here. We all know what the impact of a few cases of BSE had on the beef sector in Canada. Half of all the pigs in the world are found in China. The current outbreak of ASF in China is estimated to have wiped out half their swine herd. In other words, 25% of the world's pork population succumbed to one disease. The foot and mouth disease outbreak in the United Kingdom resulted in the culling of over 6 million animals and cost their taxpayers about $6 billion, all because of some infected meat product from another country slipped past their regulatory and inspection system. Animal diseases have plagued the raising of livestock since the dawn of history. They continue to evolve to counter the practices producers use to keep their animals safe. There are some 200 to 300 potential diseases of pigs in the natural environment, any of which could become the next epidemic disease. PDV in pigs was almost an unknown disease 15 years ago. Yet in a matter of months in 2013, it spread amongst the whole American swine herd to become endemic. For individual sow operations, PDV can kill 70 to 80% of newborn pigs. Fortunately, in Manitoba, we've been able to control the disease through best practices in biosecurity from farm to processing plant. But it is an ongoing threat which could explode out of control in a matter of months. Using science and appropriate technologies, livestock producers have developed effective husbandry practices to minimize the ability of many diseases to have significant impact on production animals. There are international agreements, agencies, and standards covering the trade and movement of animals and livestock products. In Canada, the federal and provincial governments work cooperatively to manage animal diseases in collaboration with producers and their organizations, as well as practicing veterinarians and research institutions. Standards for diagnosing and reporting diseases are in place. There's always room for improvement, but all parties recognize the dangers. Just to illustrate some of the ways the pork sector manages diseases in Manitoba, the raising of pigs has been broken into 3 separate stages with specialized barns at separate sites. The sow barns will produce 12-pound ISO weans, which are sent to nursery barns on a different site to be fed to 40-pounder weights. These then move on to finisher barns to be fed to about 285 pounds before being shipped to a processing plant. This separation of barns is an attempt to minimize the spreading of disease inside a barn amongst the different age groups. This allows the barns to be washed and disinfected after different crops of animals. In the barns, animals and their manure are separated by the use of slatted floors. Clean water is provided using nipple drinkers, and fresh feed is provided regularly. Medications are used for sick animals on a prescribed basis. Trained staff monitor the performance of animals regularly during the day and evenings. The barns are environmentally controlled to provide fresh air, which is heated in winter. Staff have to follow protocols such as shower in and shower out and avoid contact with other barns. Access to the barn is limited to key individuals. The goal is to create what is called a restricted access zone. Outside the barn, producers have created controlled access zones to minimize the amount of foot and vehicular traffic to reduce the potential for infectious agents to be carried into the barn. Livestock transporters now clean and disinfect their trailers regularly at commercial wash stations designed for this purpose. All animal movements on public highways are reported to CFIA through the Pig Trace Canada program. Feed ingredients which are imported are inspected and regulated by the federal government to reduce the potential for disease introductions. Despite all these measures, producers are very vulnerable to a number of serious diseases. There are a limited number of vaccines or antibiotics available for the range of potential diseases. For some diseases, all a producer can do is depopulate the barn and do a deep clean and disinfect. Diseases such as ASF are so serious that all animal movements in Canada and exports could be stopped. While some diseases can spread through dust and wind through the barn ventilation systems, most are brought into the barn on something, usually clothing, footwear, materials, feed, or other animals. A disease like PDV can be active in the dirt just outside the barn door. Often it takes only a very small amount of infectious agent to completely engulf a barn in a matter of days. It is said that a thimbleful of PDV can infect all the pigs in Canada. And just financially, it costs a producer about $40,000 to clean a standard sow barn, apart from all the losses in animals and wasted feed. The amendments to the Animal Diseases Act recognize the importance of biosecurity measures to protect the welfare of animals under a producer's care. All the efforts to manage disease in the barn can be rendered useless in a matter of minutes by the dirty footwear of individuals who have no legal reason to be in the barn. Producers are entitled to some modicum of protection and law from so-called concerned citizens. These amendments are sensible measures to update a critical piece of legislation. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. The Honorable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. Certainly thank you for your long service both to the province of Manitoba and to Manitoba Pork. And we wish you well in your retirement, but you're always a source of information for us when we need that. So thank you again, Chair.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Andrew, for your inputs and thoughts.
The Honorable Mr. Gerard.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and it's great to see you here today and coming back for. I wish you well in retirement. You talk about the cost of $40,000 just to clean a barn where there's a potential infection. I mean, there's a real economic interest in getting this right. And over the time that you've been there, I think there's probably been increased biosecurity. Tell us a little bit about the changes that have happened and why this bill is needed now.
Mr. Dixon.
I mean, I've worked on pig farms for many years and go back a long time on this. And today we have finally got to the point where I think we can, with the systems that we have in place, we can do a good job of physically trying to control for diseases. This idea of showering in and showering out, essentially what it is means you leave your dirty clothes on one side of the barn and you get into barn clothes on the other side of the shower. We don't even do that in hospitals. People can wander into a hospital in their outdoor clothes and go visit people in beds and stuff like this. We don't do that in our hog barns now. Our trailers, we actually bake them now in specialized units that take them up to a certain temperature to try and kill the bugs inside. We're trying to reduce our exposure to the diseases all the time using physical measures as much as possible. And these zones that we've created in these barns, and it's been a long haul trying to get here. It's taken us, 25, 30 years to get to this point. We don't want to see that just breaking down because we're concerned about people's right to protest and so on. There's nothing in this legislation that stops anybody from protesting outside a processing plant or outside a barn on the public highway. All we're asking to do is don't go inside the barn, and please don't interfere with the animals on the trailers.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for Mr. Dixon? Seeing no further questions, we thank you very much for your presentation, and we will now move on to the next presenter. I will now call on Krista Kruger, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Ms. Kruger?
Hello.
Ms. Kruger, you may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. I know a lot of people are hoping to speak tonight, so I will keep this brief. I did want to talk about the aspect of biosecurity, understanding that potential health threats do exist, and it's a good idea. It's certainly prudent to set some sort of a standard for biosecurity. But as I point out, this is a standard. It's written in large part by the industry with industry input. And so when this particular amendment was written in such a way as to severely and criminally penalize any outside interference of farm animals, singling out activists and whistleblowers, I find myself wondering about a lot of different things. I find myself wondering whether or not the producers, workers, transporters, slaughterhouse workers, will they be held to the same account if there's any breach of biosecurity that may result in a potential threat? And I wonder too if they are also will be issued the same potential fines and prison sentences if they breach their biosecurity. I also find myself wondering that now with all these biosecure zones, free from outside interference. What does this mean to future public events? Events like livestock auctions, rodeos, fairs. Don't these events involve animals? And aren't these animals eventually destined to be food as well? How can we have a biosecure area or function when animals from various different operations are coming into direct contact with one another or indirect contact with through public handling? These events are far more of an exposure hazard in my mind than a handful of activists that are just giving water to thirsty pigs. And what about the business of dumping potentially diseased bodies at a public landfill? I don't understand this. When that first hit the news, I was just gobsmacked. I just didn't understand how this could even be legal, and certainly it's not very biosecure. And finally, what about the cost to the taxpayers? The industry is basically asking for special consideration in terms of policing and access to courts. And who pays, as another commenter asked, who's going to pay for this when the bill is challenged? Is that going to be on the taxpayer as well? And again, I don't want my taxpayer dollars going to fight a challenge in a court. In the end, if we need to update these laws, let's do so in a reasonable and thoughtful way instead of conning the public under the guise of biosecurity that, quite frankly, doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you try to apply it to people giving thirsty, overheated animals water. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. The Honourable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Krista, for your input tonight on there, and you brought forward some points. Also, no questions.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Krista, really appreciate your quick and brilliant and impressive points that you raised. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
The Honourable Mr. Gerard.
Yeah, Krista, thank you for coming and presenting today. Perhaps you could share with us a little bit of what motivated you to get very interested in this this area.
Ms. Kruger.
Thank you. My motivation is I come from an animal rights background, but I also have a deep interest and also an education in science. And when this issue about biosecurity came up, it really sort of rubbed me the wrong way because I just don't feel as though it's really taken seriously anyways. Having had brilliant professors and instructors over the years who have taught me about safety in the lab and how to be secure and how to avoid transmission. Also running a cat rescue for the last 25 years. We deal with the same kinds of, coronaviruses and other types of viruses, and we have to be very careful. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the provincial vet would shut us down in a heartbeat if we didn't even practice standards, like minimal standards. So when I'm looking at this, I just don't understand how you can take those animals off of the operation into an auction or a rodeo or whatever, and have those animals come back to that operation at some point in time and then go on a truck and be handled by who knows how many people. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you.
Mr. Brar.
Krista, as a follow-up question, I'm really impressed with this example of rodeos and auction marts and related examples, and especially taxpayer dollars are important, and we need to think how the best use of taxpayer dollars should be. What would your approach be if given a chance to lead on such a legislation in the legislature? What would you do different?
Ms. Kruger.
Thank you. I honestly don't feel qualified because I don't I'm not a politician and I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know how to approach something like this, but certainly I would urge a little bit of constraint and avoid knee-jerk reactions to a few incidents of people being uncomfortable. I think that there's been a sort of this us versus them has been established, and we're losing sight of what's really important here, and that's that people are safe and that animals are safe and that they are treated, both animals and people are treated well. So I would definitely say that if you're going to put a biosecurity aspect into it, please get somebody, like involve some scientists and people like that to help you write this bill.
Are there any further questions for Ms. Kruger? Seeing no further questions, we thank you very much for your presentation, and we will now move on to the next presenter.
Thank you.
I will now call on Kristen Lau-Jansen and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Kristen?
Hello, thank you.
Kristen, we don't have well, maybe it's coming. No video of you. Oh, here it's coming slowly.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. Yes, your video is there now. You may proceed
great.
with your presentation.
Thank you. My name is Kristen Lau-Jansen, and I'm speaking to Bill 62 as a private citizen who is very concerned about animal welfare, particularly that of farmed animals, where transparency and accountability are in short supply. The influential industrial farming sector has been very successful over many decades in convincing governments to bend to their will and to their bottom line. In fact, we just heard Minister Pedersen acknowledge the input that the Agriculture Association has had into this bill. So in the case of Bill 62, it is clear who was consulted and who wasn't. The Animal Diseases Amendment Act is, of course, as the government well knows, designed to protect industrial farming financial interests and not to protect the well-being of animals at the heart of this system. Ag-gag acts are intended to gag whistleblowers, journalists, and the public by penalizing them for documenting and exposing the realities of how animals are treated in animal agriculture. They are designed to prevent the public from learning about animal cruelty. The ability to investigate, to document, and to publicize corporate agriculture's abuses is imperative both to the well-being of animals in Manitoba and to our own health and safety. Factory farms want to keep their cruel practices hidden from the public, but the public deserves the truth about the hundreds of thousands of animals suffering on industrial farms in Manitoba and whether laws are being broken, jeopardizing food safety, workers' rights, and environmental standards. Manitoba has an Animal Care Act that is intended to protect animals from cruelty and neglect, but conveniently, farmed animals are exempted from protection under this act. Is it any wonder then that Manitobans are concerned about animal welfare? Canada ranks among the lowest animal welfare standards across wealthy nations. For example, our animal transport regulations place Canada, as we've heard from previous speakers already this evening, at the bottom of all industrialized countries. Under current Canada Food Inspection Agency and National Farm Animal Care Council protocol, among other horrors, the practice of killing piglets by bashing their heads into the floor is the recommended practice. I quote from that protocol, blunt trauma can be administered by grasping the hind legs of a piglet and striking the top of the cranium firmly and deliberately against a flat, hard surface. Is it really any wonder then that Manitobans are outraged at this cruelty? And is it any wonder that people want to be able to expose the truth of what takes place behind closed doors on industrial farms? But of course, there are myriad more reasons why Manitobans are rightfully concerned about animal welfare on farms. In the last 10 years, over 40,000 pigs have been killed in fires on industrial hog farms in Manitoba. I think this statistic speaks volumes about the level and quality of animal welfare and safety standards practiced by the current industrial hog farm operators in Manitoba. It says they don't care and they flout safety standards. Of course, barn fires kill lots of other animals as well. In 2019, of course, 800 cows perished in a barn fire outside of Steinbach. We've also heard about another horrific and archaic practice that's allowed in Manitoba, which is gestation crates. These are the steel pens that literally encase a female pig and allow her no movement at all. Tens of thousands of pigs in Manitoba spend almost their entire sad lives in these crates, never moving. The EU banned these crates almost 10 years ago, except for the period from weaning of the previous litter until the end of the first 4 weeks of gestation. In the US, these crates are banned totally in 10 states, with more moving to ban them. And these are also banned outright in the UK, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland. Battery cages still dominate egg production. Battery cages for hens, as you've heard tonight, are so small that no bird can move, not to walk, not to spread their wings. They spend their entire miserable existence rammed with several birds into these cages stacked on cages, so the feces and urine from those above coat those below. The Canadian egg industry has said it intends to phase out battery cages by 2036. If that is true, and they do that, then only a few billion more chickens will have to suffer in those cages over the next 15 years. In the face of all this and other terrible, horrific, everyday cruelties that you've heard described this evening, the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Dori Gingera-Beauchemin, recently wrote to me in regard to Bill 62 that anyone entering farms to witness and document animal suffering could, and I quote, cause injury and stress to the animals. In the face of how the farmers are allowed to treat their animals in Manitoba under current legislation, this statement is so ludicrous as to be laughable if the plight of these animals wasn't so overwhelmingly tragic. And hearing just before me several representatives from the ag industry using biosecurity as the guise for this legislation, I wanted to reiterate what earlier speakers addressed, that while zoonotic diseases have had devastating impact on animals and people in various countries and regions for decades, more than decades, of course, there isn't a documented instance of this happening due to animal activists. All of these instances and these increasing instances, from Spanish flu a century ago to mad cow to COVID, all these diseases and all the diseases in between, these arose from the common practices on farms and in slaughterhouses. Biodiversity and pandemics are a real and increasing threat, but a significant factor of the rise of these is the awful conditions in which animals are kept in these intensive farming situations where there's overcrowding, illness and injury to animals are rife, and weaken animal immune systems, making them more susceptible to disease, and the crowding, of course, contributing to rapid transmission. It's these conditions that foster disease, and these conditions which farms are so desperate to hide. So I think we need to drop the pretense that this law is in any way, shape, or form designed for the protection of animals or biosecurity. If you are going to enact this law, that we be honest, you be honest about what you're doing, and that this is a law that hides an industry replete with institutionalized and normalized cruelty. It shelters this industry and its shocking everyday practices from any real accountability and transparency. This allows this industry to maintain terrible or non-existent animal welfare standards that allows them to maximize profits at the expense of animal welfare and human and environmental health. So I would implore anyone voting for this law to really consider those images, of animals, piglets being bashed to death day in and day out, for example, on hog farms across Manitoba. because that is the kind of practice that you're allowing to remain behind closed doors when you vote for this law. And as someone said earlier, I would recommend anyone considering voting for this law to make unannounced visits to a few industrial farms or slaughterhouses or trucking transport stations across the province, so you yourselves can see the suffering that takes place every day. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation, Kristen. The Honorable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Ms. Lon Jensen, for your presentation.
Mr. Brar.
Kristen, thank you so much for your presentation, your research, and your views on this.
The Honorable Mr. Gerard.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen, for coming and presenting. Perhaps you could tell us what has got you so passionate about this whole area.
Miss Law Jensen.
Thank you. To me, the unfairness really is disturbing to me. It is unconscionable to me that there's an industry that gets such a free pass at being transparent and accountable, and is able to maintain so that they can keep their profit margin, and is able to maintain these standards through this indirect subsidy of having laws like this and others that allow them to operate with the types of standards we've heard talked about, the shocking transportation hours that are allowed in Canada is astonishing, and the lowest in the world for developed countries. That to me is just unconscionable that this industry gets this free pass at the expense of sentient beings, not at the expense of just inanimate, inanimate objects that they're producing on a production line.
Thank you.
Carmen. I will now call on Carmen Asu and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Carmen, are you there? Carmen, could you turn your audio and video on, please? Unmute yourself and turn your video on. Carmen is having some technical difficulties, so we will move on to the next presenter. And we'll come back to her a little later. I will now call on Crystal Sadowski and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Crystal?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Crystal. You may proceed with your presentation. Crystal Sadowski.
Thank you. Good evening. I really do appreciate being able to give my opinions and my voice. So thank you. I do appreciate that. I am not a lawyer, no part of a nonprofit group. I am a recently enlightened consumer. Unfortunately, we are not here to improve our laws on cruelty regarding the care, slaughter, and transportation of our commercial animals. These activities are hidden from the public. Why? Because most people would not be okay watching innocent animals being forced to starve, dehydrate, collapse from fatigue, gasp for air, overheat, and freeze to death. And this is just in transportation. So no, I'm not okay. People care more than we think when given a choice. They just don't get to see these sufferings. Unfortunately, what they do get to see are happy cows on cartons, smiling pigs in chef's hats, and dancing chickens. This is brainwashing. This is not right. This is not okay. Many animals don't survive the long, torturous trip to the slaughterhouse and are then tossed aside like garbage, as seen recently at the Brady landfill, when lives are deemed no longer useful. None of this is okay. And without caring citizens trying to protect animal welfare, there is no one to shine light on these crimes. It is claimed that Bill 62 is for the safety reasons such as biosecurity, but what this really is just another way to prevent the truth from being seen. A law to protect animals in distress is blocked by another law stating that these practices are protected under acceptable activities. Well, this is not acceptable. If farmers and slaughterhouses are so concerned with biosecurity, then why are the cases and data not there to support these concerns? I see plenty of data and cases supporting crimes against animals that go unnoticed in every transport truck that goes by. I've seen it with my own eyes. Diseases occur when conditions are poor, when animals are in constant distress, and from infections that attack their bodies from mistreatment, not photos, not videos. A question I have is what is happening to all of the animals during this pandemic when processing plants are unable to process due to the COVID-19 shutdowns? Have their bodies made it to the grocery stores, or have they made it to the landfill due to bottleneck issues? As a caring citizen of Manitoba, please find better ways and lead the rest of Canada into a fair, compassionate direction. Animal transportation standards is a great place to start. Thank you for being a province that encourages people to speak and empower positive change. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Crystal. The Honourable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Crystal, for your presentation tonight. No questions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Brar?
No questions.
No. Do we have any further questions? Mr. Sala?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much, Crystal, for taking time to come present to us tonight and share your passion about making sure animals stay as safe as possible. I'm wondering if you could maybe just share just briefly what led to your enlightenment that you referenced earlier.
Yes, thank you.
Ms. Sadowski, I must recognize you first.
Thank you.
Ms. Sadowski, proceed.
Thank you. For the last year and a half, I have taken liberty of helping feral cats It started there, and then I started to join more and more groups. I'm not a nonprofit, just a happy, friendly Manitoban who cares. And as I continued to look further and dig further, I started to get really upset and traumatized because I didn't know this was happening. I knew as a meat eater that things were wrong, but I didn't know about transportation. I didn't know about certain things. And if it wasn't for people videotaping these, taking photos and sharing the true story, I would not know. So I have been literally traumatized, and I'm really sad. And thank you for letting me say this because it's very important.
Thank you.
The Honorable Mr. Gerard.
Thank you, Crystal, for coming and presenting. You've mentioned that you think that animal transportation should be an area which needs special attention.
Yes, sir.
What would you put forward as your ideas to improve animal transportation?
Ms. Sadowski?
Thank you. As a now committed vegan, the positive change can start with the transportation improvements regarding the compassionate travel for these unfortunate animals. Temperature controlled transportation is not a new invention. It already exists. It's just not chosen. Right now, water, food, rest, and weather concerns should be a high priority if we are to properly manage these crises that I call. To start, work on transportation. It's a start. It's not the end, but it is a start. Please consider this.
Are there any further questions for Ms. Sadowski? Seeing no further questions, we thank you very much for your presentation, and we will now move on to, actually, we're going to move back to Carmen Asu. She seems to have her technical difficulties corrected. I will now call on Carmen Asu and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Carmen, are you there? Carmen, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, we can hear you as well, but we seem to be getting a lot of... Do you have something else on? Carmen, it seems you may be on two devices. You need to turn one of them off because it's backfeeding.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Oh my gosh.
Okay, we can see you and we can hear you. Carmen, you may proceed with your presentation.
My huge apologies, but this is short, so it'll kind of balance off that terrible timing. Good evening, everyone. My name is Carmen Asu, and I'm speaking as a private citizen. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on behalf of animals, and especially those millions in the farming industry in Manitoba. About 2 months ago, I received a very colorful professional flyer announcing the return and opening of apparently one of the zoo's most beloved attractions,
Aunt Sally's farm. I remember visiting Aunt Sally's farm, and what remains in my memory are bunches of kids running around chasing and grabbing at rabbits and guinea pigs. And even then, it was problematic. Although Aunt Sally's farm will not be a petting zoo, there will still be the opportunity to get up pretty close and personal by playing alongside lively goats. I would imagine hundreds of pictures will be taken and shared on social media to record the joys of being at a modern-day barnyard. Because that is what I am told I will experience if I take a trip to Aunt Sally's farm, a modern-day barnyard, home to goats, pigs, llamas, and donkeys, complete with bridges with rainbow platforms that encourage goats to climb overhead. So, you know, goat enrichment. I will also learn about agriculture in Manitoba, sustainable farming practices, and what I can do to contribute to a healthy ecosystem. Doing my own bit of research, I discovered that the modern-day hog barn industry processed over 5.5 million pigs in 2019. In Manitoba, there are 590 hog barns at least, with 3.4 million pigs. The average herd size of 5,720 head per farm represents the largest pig farms in Canada. The numbers of chickens processed are equally, if not more, staggering. When I contacted Assiniboine Park Zoo to inquire how I might learn about the modern-day barnyard and agriculture in Manitoba, I was told that there would be signage on a variety of topics. But no, the interpretive signs would not include the number of animals kept in factory farm conditions, the use of containment, such as gestation crates and battery cages, and how the millions of animals are transported to slaughter. However, Aunt Sally's farm does encourage me, along with other visitors, to find local farmers that prioritize good animal welfare practice. Is there a list of these farms? Do they include little hobby farms along with factory farm industries? Would I be able to witness how pigs, cows, chickens are raised from start to finish, and including transport? With the laws already in place, I don't believe I would be a welcome visitor. Can I take a few pictures of animals crowded in these farms and barns? How about animals in transport trucks in the dead of winter or hottest days of summer? Bill 62 seeks to strengthen the laws to keep observers away. Intensive factory farm is a misery from start, the second an animal is born, to finish, including transport to the slaughterhouse. People generally have little awareness of the abusive practices that cause so much animal suffering in modern-day agriculture. This only comes to light when there is a breach of protocol, such as the live chickens found at the Brady landfill, which several people have talked about, amongst the thousands of chickens that had been humanely euthanized. People have a right to know about the animals that they eat and how they are treated. Why keep the bar so low in modern-day farming in Manitoba? Why not enact laws for the real protection of animals, rather than further hiding the truth of intensive farming? Aunt Sally's farm presents a fairy tale view of a modern-day barnyard. In a modern-day barnyard, there are no lively animals of any kind playing alongside anyone. Most can barely move. And thank you.
We thank you for your presentation, Mrs. Ansu. The Honorable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Carmen, for your presentation, and I do hope you go visit Aunt Sally's farm just to see what's there and see Assiniboine Zoo. Thank you. No question.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Carmen, for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Are there any, Mr. Gerard, the Honorable Mr. Gerard?
Yeah. Carmen, thank you for coming and staying till this point in the evening and making your presentation. Have you been on a farm in Manitoba at all yet, or will it just be Sally's farm when you get to the zoo?
Well, when I calm down. Long ago, I did. I visited a couple
Hold
of
it,
farms.
Carmen, I need to introduce you before you can start speaking.
All right.
Miss Ansu?
Many, many years ago, I did go to farms of friends. I'm a city girl, really. And I went to a grain farm, and I went to really a small family farm. I guess in the days when people had, some chickens and some cows and so on. So that's sort of my image of long ago of what farms are like. And I think that's what Aunt Sally's farm is going to show. Like, that's what a farm is. But we know that farms are not like that anymore. And I guess in the olden days, people did care for their animals, and even though they kind of ended up on your plate at some point, the care of them was not like it is now. And I think that's what many, many people before me have spoken about, is the intensity and the real cruelty that happens with animals.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? If not, we will move on to, we're going to go back to Debbie Wall, presenter number 8. I will now call on Debbie Wall and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Debbie, are you there? Can you turn your video on? Yes, we can see you now. Can you try turning your audio on? Unmute yourself. You're still muted, Debbie. Can you, Debbie, could you try unmute your phone? Debbie, could you try pressing *6 on your phone?
Oh, it just says I'm unmuted.
Okay, Debbie, we've got you there. You may now proceed with your presentation.
All right, just give me a. Oh, are you getting feedback at all? Okay, I'm ready to go here. I'm getting a little bit of echo on my end. How about you?
Okay, Debbie, you can proceed with your presentation.
Okay, I'm just getting echo on my side, so I hope you guys aren't. Okay, I just want to say that I'm speaking from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota nations. Sorry, I'm just going to... There. Oh, that's much better. And the homeland of the Métis. And they also acknowledge all animals with whom we traditionally shared the lands and also who we treated with respect and dignity. We have ways to make you eat tofu. I just wanted you to know what an animal rights terrorist sounds like, because you will no doubt be hearing that term, because it is so overused, it has been rendered meaningless and without impact. And truly, I would love to be a fly in the wall as it is explained to those who lost loved ones on 9/11 or a limb during the Boston Marathon bombing, how advocating for the most vulnerable in our society in a nonviolent manner constitutes terrorism. I first became familiar with the family of the leader of a provincial political party when their dog was brought to a veterinary clinic where I worked. But Lane was not presented as the family dog. Lane was introduced as my brother. I'm sure it's safe to say that most in attendance also have companion animals who they view as family members. Some may call them their fur babies, equating their importance in their lives to that of children. I call the other animals my cousins. They may be viewed as fellow earthlings, or, in the words of philosopher Jeremy Bentham, as other nations. And it was he who famously posed, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? So, why is it those who commodify and exploit them get to call the shots when it comes to how much of that suffering is acceptable? Canada has the shameful reputation of having some of the poorest animal transportation and protection laws in the developed world. Agricultural use is but one on an exhaustive list of so-called accepted activities that are exempt as long as codes of practice are followed. It has to be, because this industry could not exist if held to the same standard of care legally required of those with companion animals. We are told our laws are based on science and not emotion. So why is it that only those animals who we are emotionally attached to, those lucky enough to be deemed pets, are given a modicum of protection when science informs us that all are equally capable of suffering? In an October 2020 op-ed piece in the Winnipeg Free Press, President of Keystone Agricultural Producers of Manitoba, Bill Campbell, assured readers operations are regularly inspected. In a follow-up phone call where I asked him how regular these inspections are, he indicated he did not know. I called the Minister of Agriculture's office, who referred me to the Chief Veterinary Office, who informed me the CVO enforces the Animal Care Act based on complaints received from the public. Bill 62 will ensure they will receive even fewer of those complaints. In June of last year, I started writing monthly to both the provincial and federal Departments of Agriculture, wanting to know how many animals were victims of depopulation due to the pandemic, and by which means they were killed. In October, I finally received a reply from the province indicating, quote, humane, and that's another quote, euthanasia procedures on these farms are not managed or directed by our department. End quote. I have yet to receive a reply from the feds. Odd that a government who purports to take the matter of animal welfare very seriously in any correspondence I do receive either can't or won't supply that information. Maple Leaf Foods suspended all interaction with me when I asked for video proof that the CO2 gas chambers used in their slaughterhouse are as humane as they claim to be. This before I could ask if they release the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Could you imagine if the response to the horrific conditions in some long-term care homes was to criminalize those who exposed it? Bill 62 is the equivalent for farmed animals who deserve more oversight and protection, not less. Having worked in veterinary clinics for 35 years, I attended many deaths. For the most part, these were elderly patients who had lived full lives with a loving family. And by far the most beautiful euthanasias were performed at clients' homes, often in a favorite setting, such as outside in a garden. My role was to gently restrain the patient during the administration of IV medication, so their last experience on this earth was to see and hear their guardians bidding them goodbye. I have seen people pay hundreds for what is essentially the injection of a few dollars worth of drugs. Why? They wanted to ensure their beloved family's death was as peaceful as possible. Compare that to what happens to hundreds of millions of farmed animals in this country every year. In the egg industry, male chicks are killed immediately after hatching by gassing, suffocation, or being ground up alive in a macerator. Baby pigs are quote-unquote euthanized by swinging them by their hind legs and smashing their heads onto concrete. How can this be legal, you ask? Well, amazingly, euthanasia is another so-called accepted activity, making it a most obscene oxymoron. A former Manitoba hog barn worker described how a sow was killed by hanging. Because of her thick, muscular neck, it took 5 minutes before she finally strangled to death. I am now halfway through my 10-minute presentation. Animals are crowded into trailers in extremes of weather ranging from frigid cold to blistering heat, with no food, water, or rest to be transported to a slaughterhouse. A house of slaughter. There are those who will survive the initial shackling, stunning, and throat slitting and enter a scalding tank still alive. Their last experience on this earth, after a life not worth living, is to be scalded to death. And throughout their existence, the only time a few lucky ones may encounter human kindness will be through the ventilation holes of a trailer, as activists show them some compassion or quench their thirst with water. And Bill 62 wants to criminalize that. Ontario ag laws use the outrageous term animal protection zones, but not wanting to waste a good pandemic, here in Manitoba they will be referred to as biosecurity zones. If we are so concerned about zoonoses, pandemics, and biosecurity, why will throngs of children be allowed to interact with the residents of Aunt Sally's farm? Why are sheep, goats, calves, and cattle from differing origins all paraded through the same auction ring with no disinfection in between? Why have we not shut down mink farms, where COVID has proven to be bidirectional, jumping from humans to minks, back to humans again, with the potential to merely mutate along the way? Why are the corpses of victims of depopulation dumped at Brady landfill like so much garbage? Why do we continue the live export of millions of animals to 55 countries, including horses to Japan, for slaughter to become a delicacy? Why are we not cracking down on the trade in wildlife? And why are we not phasing out factory farming that has already given rise to, for example, swine flu in 2009 and avian flu in 2013? No activists required. Factory farms check off all the boxes for conditions that could produce the next pandemic. Hundreds, if not thousands, of genetically similar animals are crammed into windowless warehouses, their lungs compromised by inhaling ammonia from their own waste. Vectors of disease, such as flies and rodents, can move in and out of buildings, making claims regarding biosecurity a moot point. And what about farmers and workers who breach biosecurity protocol? 78% of antibiotics used in Canada are given to farmed animals, leading to the evolution of superbugs. The idea the other animals in the environment are here for us and not with us is how we arrived at the dark place we find ourselves today. Besides being responsible for suffering on a scale never before witnessed on this planet, animal agriculture is one of the main drivers behind the climate catastrophe and biodiversity loss. The consumption of animal products is linked to many of our chronic diseases, some of which are comorbidities associated with COVID deaths. It is time we aligned our subsidies with Canada's Food Guide, a document produced by 37 scientists over 3 years with no industry influence. The billions of dollars given to animal agriculture could be used to help transition farmers to compassionate, sustainable, and healthy plant-based systems. And until that end is achieved, we must bring our laws into the 21st century, mandate the use of climate-controlled transport trucks, and install CCTV cameras in all facilities where animals are raised, transported, and slaughtered, so there is no doubt as to what conditions they must endure. Because what is truly a nightmare for this industry is not the possibility of animals being exposed to pathogens inadvertently introduced by activists, but the prospect of the suffering, both inherent and egregious, being exposed to public scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Wall. The Honorable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Ms. Wall.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Debbie, thanks for your presentation. I would just want to know your thoughts about the consultation process that happened before framing this legislation.
Ms. Wall.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can repeat the question, Debbie. I want to know your thoughts about the consultation process that happened before framing this legislation. Were you consulted or people in your community consulted before bringing this legislation in the legislature?
Ms. Wall.
I guess I'm still not quite understanding the question and how it relates to my presentation. Sorry. I mean, I found out about this bill through social media and decided to make a presentation because this is something I feel very strongly about.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make it simple, Debbie. Did you get a chance to put your feelings forward before this bill was framed?
Ms. Wall.
I was not made aware that there was an opportunity to do that.
The Honorable Mr. Gerard.
Thank you, Debbie, for coming and presenting and staying as long as you have to do so. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what stimulated your interest in this area.
Ms.
Well,
Wall.
what personally, my aha moment occurred when I was actually taking pre-veterinary courses at the U of M and went to the annual Aggie Bash and went to the Glenlee Research Farm, and there's a little calf there. And I went to visit the calf, and he or she started licking my face, and I just realized they're no different from a dog. And I would never I would never treat my dog the way animals in the farming, in industrial farms are treated. Having said that, earlier, like I had actually had such a disconnect that I had visited a slaughterhouse, and I was on a kill floor. And at that time, I just went, well, this is what we do to cows, and this is how we treat our pets. But it was that little calf that made me realize there's really no difference between the two.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for Ms. Wall? Seeing none, we thank you very much for your presentation. We will now move on to the next presenter. I will now call on Tyler Fulton, Manitoba beef producers, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Mr. Fulton?
Hello.
You may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and all the members of the Standing Committee on Agriculture. As you said, my name is Tyler Fulton, and I'm the president of Manitoba Beef Producers. My family and I have a multi-generation cow-calf operation in the Birtle area, one that's been in my family for decades. On behalf of Manitoba Beef Producers, I'm pleased to provide a few comments regarding Bill 62, the Animal Diseases and Amendment Act. Manitoba Beef Producers is the primary voice of Manitoba's beef industry, representing approximately 6,300 producers involved in various aspects of the beef industry, including the cow-calf, backgrounding, and finishing sectors. Manitoba Beef Producers has a 14-person board of directors who represent producers in different geographic areas of the province. Our mission is to represent all beef producers through communication, advocacy, research, and education within the industry and to government, consumers, and others to improve prosperity and ensure a sustainable future. The importance of Manitoba's cattle industry to the economy cannot be understated. Manitoba Manitoba cattle and calf sales accounted for 6 to 7% of Canadian farm cash receipts from cattle and calves over the period of 2014 to 2018. Further, Manitoba cattle and calf sales accounted for 8 to 12% of the total province's farm cash receipts. It has been estimated that the Manitoba beef sector generated in the range of 14,540 to close to 16,000 person years of employment jobs in the province, in the provincial economy over the same period. A thriving beef industry generates considerable economic, environmental, and social opportunities and benefits for Canada. Maintaining the health and safety of their cattle, of our cattle, is key for Manitoba's beef producers. Working in conjunction with experts such as veterinarians, animal feed nutritionists, and others, producers develop herd health management strategies for their animals. Critical components of these strategies include the creation and adherence to biosecurity measures to help reduce the risk of the introduction of foreign animal diseases or potential contaminants that could harm animals. The Code of Practice for the care and handling of beef cattle and the Canadian Beef Cattle On-Farm Biosecurity Standard provide critical guidance in areas such as provide critical guidance in areas such as practices and procedures that reduce the risk and impact of disease in cattle operations. For example, a key principle of the standard is managing the movement of people, vehicles, equipment, and tools. Additionally, there are national standards with respect to the movement of livestock, covering factors such as loading and unloading and care and protection of animals during transport. There are also legislative and regulatory frameworks which, with respect to animal care and disease prevention, such as Manitoba's Animal Diseases Act and the Federal Health of Animals Act. They set out mechanisms for protecting animal health through the control or elimination of diseases and toxic substances, among other matters related to animal health. Manitoba beef producers recognizes the efforts of the provincial government to try to protect livestock from potential risks caused by people's actions, either inadvertent or deliberate. These could include introduction of foreign animal diseases and devastating animal health and economic and trade consequences that could accompany them. For example, it's been estimated that a foot and mouth disease outbreak in Canada would cost approximately $65 billion in losses and affect not just the livestock industry, but also Canada's grain industry, the veterinary sector, and other areas. It's imperative that rigorous biosecurity practices are followed to prevent damaging and devastating events like this. Another consideration is risk of the introduction of invasive species and noxious weeds, which can have production and health implications for cattle, as well as negative environmental effects. An example of this is leafy spurge, one of the most difficult to control noxious weeds in Manitoba. This weed can hitch a ride on vehicles which have driven through areas which were already contaminated with it and can easily reestablish. It's also very important to reduce the potential for injuries or stress to animals due to negative encounters with people, vehicles, and or equipment entering land or facilities used for livestock production. Unfortunately, some Manitoba cattle producers have experienced the negative effects of people accessing their pasture, fields, production facilities without a clear understanding of potential harm their actions may cause, be that from an animal health, safety, environmental, or environmental perspective. This has included instances such as gates being left open, thereby allowing cows to get out and being placed in harm's way, cases of livestock being spooked or chased by people and vehicles, pastures, fields, and crops being torn up by vehicles, and grass fires caused by sparks from vehicles, tossed cigarette butts, etc. which can also place livestock at risk. By seeking consent prior to accessing a biosecurity zone or interacting with animals in such a zone, people can become informed of potential hazards which may exist. This includes the presence of livestock, dugouts, wells, equipment in the area, etc. Appropriate steps can be taken to minimize the impact of the person's access to the farm or ranch and the animals present there. As well, it's important to note that Manitoba's beef producers manage thousands of acres of privately owned and agricultural crown lands, providing biodiversity and habitat for an array of wildlife, while also raising cattle. Manitoba beef producers recognizes and respects that provincial law cannot override the legal rights of First Nations and other Indigenous people to exercise their hunting, trapping, fishing, and other rights on lands where Indigenous and treaty rights can normally be exercised. Similarly, Manitoba beef producers recognizes other citizens to have the right to access agricultural crown lands for the purposes of hunting, recreational use, etc. Manitoba beef producers does, however, wish to restate its request for informed access to ACL, to agricultural crown lands, whereby potential users would notify the lease or permit holder of their intent to access that land. This is requested to help protect the safety and well-being of both the livestock and the land users, such as the biosecurity or the production conditions outlined above, to advise of the presence of livestock in the certain locations. It would also help provide a means of reminding prospective land users of the importance of closing gates and not engaging in practices that might damage pastures and forages in sensitive areas. As well, in the event of a disease outbreak, having knowledge of who accessed the land and when would be invaluable from a traceability and disease management perspective. Manitoba beef producers strongly recommends that additional work be done to help inform the general public who may wish to access private and public lands about the rationale behind and need for adherence to the biosecurity practices. MBP requests continued engagement with the provincial government as the regulations that will accompany this legislation are developed. For example, this would include clarification as to how the biosecurity zones will be established, particularly in the context of expansive agricultural operations such as cattle production, where livestock are distributed over a wide geographic area. As a cattle producer, I take very seriously my responsibility to provide my animals with a high quality of care. At our farm and on farms and ranches across Manitoba, we work very diligently to protect our animals from possible harm, including potential biosecurity breaches. As we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, the spread of disease can quickly spiral if health standards are not adhered to. We ask that all those who interact with our livestock adhere to the same types of practices to reduce risk and the possibility of negative outcomes.
Mr. Fulton, unfortunately, time for your presentation has ran out, so we will now move into questions. The Honorable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Tyler, for your presentation tonight. Thank you for staying with us this late. I know morning comes early on the ranch, and we certainly appreciate your input into this discussion tonight. Thank you.
Mr. Brar?
Thank you, Tyler, for your presentation. And I would like to ask you what's something best that you like in this bill and what's something that you do not like that much? Two things in this bill.
Mr. Fulton.
Well, what I like about it is really the focus on prevention. 9 times out of 10, when there's a disease outbreak on our farm, we don't know the exact cause of it. And so it's really, when you're dealing with animal health, 90% of what you can do is about prevention. And so I believe that prevention aspect is built into the bill. I think there could be some more clarity on the, on how it interacts with in the context of agricultural crown lands. That would be an aspect that I'd like greater clarity on.
The Honourable Mr. Gerard.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler, and for staying till this point to be able to present. You had talked a little bit about biosecurity, and perhaps you mentioned two specific biosecurity measures which were important in terms of cattle. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more.
Mr. Fulton.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'll give you an example. It's calving season right now, and last year at this time, we were really struggling with an outbreak of what we think was effectively a version of a coronavirus. And we really struggled to get ahead of it. We ended up changing our practices so that it simply minimized the potential for exposure. And so it kind of comes back to that, trying to solve the mystery, but prevent the transmission to begin with. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fulton, I would like to ask if you witnessed any biosecurity breaches at your farm in the recent past.
Mr. Fulton.
Just for perspective, we operate on about 6,000 acres. We don't have any, cameras or anything like that. So we regularly have trespassers. We have people that access the land that don't receive permission in advance. And so, for example, thankfully, we don't, for example, have a leafy spurge outbreak on our operation, but I am constantly looking for it. And I think it's probably more a question of when than if. So with that in mind, I think we have had some biosecurity breaches, and that there have been likely some aspects of disease that have been tracked onto our farm inadvertently, but I can't track back exactly what animal health, which one was related to it. As you can imagine, on 6,000 acres, it's a difficult thing to monitor.
We thank you for your presentation, Mr. Fulton, and we will now move on to the next presenter. I will now call on Janice Pennington and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Janice, is that you there?
Yeah.
Janice, you may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson and the committee members for giving me the opportunity to speak. My name is Janice Pennington, and I'm speaking in opposition of Bill 62 as a concerned private citizen and as a lifelong animal activist. I hope this speech can make any sense to you now, because after 5 hours, I've edited and crossed off half the things that people that preceded me had already presented on. So I'm going to ask a few questions. If this bill is something that the government feels is important, what's going to be next? Are you going to make it illegal for somebody to divulge food safety issues at a processing plant or a restaurant, and you're going to have them charged for exposing that? Will people be charged if they go and expose the inhumane practices in a personal care home? Or will somebody be exposed because a business is polluting rivers or streams or the lakes in our province, and we're going to charge them for exposing that to the public. Routine violations of animal welfare should not be the norm, but we must do everything to ensure that that's not the case. It's time for Manitoba to commit and put in place farm animal care and welfare laws, not assist the industry in hiding what goes on behind the barn walls and during the transportation. It's already been stated before that this bill addresses biosecurity concerns. It's actually firsthand, and I've been in firsthand inside a livestock farm. I spent many summers living on a farm, a family farm. I've been outside slaughterhouses. I've seen rendering plants. I've witnessed the loading and unloading of animals from transport trucks. Hundreds and thousands of animals that I've seen in their bodily fluids. And there are very, very weak security practices that occur in these places over all our lax standards that are allowed. There is no oversight and there is no enforcement by our authorities. The industry is allowed to police themselves. Why do we not have biosecurity concerns at rural, that's something Krista had brought up, and I'd like to go over that again. We have all these rural rodeos that go on all summer long in Manitoba where there's food animals on display. No talk about biosecurity concerns there. While these animals go back to their farm, are they sprayed down with disinfectants? I don't think so. Why are there no zoonotic concerns about the Red River exhibition? Hundreds of thousands of children go and feed and handle these food animals at the agricultural display. What happens to those animals when they go back to the farm where they become food? Why do we not have strict disease concerns at the Grunthal livestock auction market? And why are there no biosecurity concerns or laws against interacting with all the animals at the Royal Winter Fair every year in Brandon? That's because Bill 62 is really not about biosecurity. It's very well known that Canada has some of the worst animal transport laws in the developed world. We've heard that several times through the night. It's also very well known that there are no provincial farm animal welfare regulations that farms must follow in regard to regulations in the treatment of their animals or biosecurity standards. Farm codes of practices are not monitored, nor are they even laws. If Bill 62 is about biosecurity and not about prohibiting citizens' access, then it would also include stronger improvements to the biosecurity practices that would be applying to everyone, not just activists. Diseases, outbreaks, kill thousands of farm animals. Yes, we've heard that. It's common all around the world. But the outbreaks are from lax standards. Have you ever seen chickens and hens being loaded onto a transport truck? I'd like to know where the biosecurity is in that process. I've seen it many times. A few people observing and documenting a transport truck presents little to no biosecurity risks. Bill 62's intent is to cover up animal abuse. Bill 62's intent is to take away people's right to free speech and peaceful assembly. Bill 62's intent is to conceal what occurs within our food system. And Bill 62 also is unconstitutional, or at this point appears to be. Should it in fact pass, it's going to become a very costly court challenge for the province of Manitoba. I'm going to point out that Manitobans care about animal welfare and how animals are raised for their food. Manitobans should be confident about where their food comes from. We should be increasing protections for animals in our food system, not sealing it off from public scrutiny and accountability. Public trust in the food system is paramount. And in closing, I'm going to ask you this. How can hiding animal abuse possibly be an acceptable for our government representatives to be supporting? And I'd like to ask, would you consider it to be extreme to provide water to a transport of overheated, thirsty dogs? I would think not. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation. Ms. Pennington, the Honorable Minister of, the Honorable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Pennington, for staying with us till a late evening here. Appreciate your input.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Janice, for your inputs, for your passion for animal welfare, and your presentation. So I would like to ask, did you get a chance to participate in the consultation process before this bill?
Ms. Pennington.
No, absolutely not. I'm quite immersed in animal advocacy in the province. I'm involved with the animal compassion team at the Winnipeg Humane Society, and no people that I know within the community were consulted on putting forth this bill.
The Honorable Mr. Gerard.
Yeah, thank you, Janice. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what got you started in your animal activism.
Ms. Pennington.
I've been an activist for animals my whole life. I mean, I had, as a young child, I guess that would be my first experience of knowing that, animals are just like us, is I had a pet crow. A very unusual pet, but he was smarter than a dog, smarter than any pet I've ever had or been around. I've been a fan for very long because that goes hand in hand with being an animal activist. I did work on a farm in the summers when I was a teenager going into my 20s, so I do have firsthand knowledge with what goes on within a family farm. They're sentient beings. They deserve to have a voice. I've been, long time advocate. I started many animal advocacy groups. One of my proud moments is I spent many, many years trying to ban the use of wild and exotic animals here in Manitoba. Successfully was able to move that ahead and have them banned in the city of Winnipeg. So no longer can wild and exotic animals be used in traveling, entertaining situations within Winnipeg.
Are there any further questions? Are there any further questions? Seeing no further questions, thank you very much for your presentation, Janice. We will now move on to our next presenter. I will now call on Acalia Robertson and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
Hi.
Acalia, you may proceed with your presentation when you are ready.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for having me speak tonight. I'll try not to repeat too much of what's been said here. My name is Acalia Robertson. I'm presenting tonight as a private citizen in opposition to Bill 62. Bill 62 is framed heavily around biosecurity concern. So I wondered, what is the track record of this government with biosecurity in the animal agriculture sector? Since the COVID-19 pandemic was declared globally, there have been numerous cases of COVID-19 outbreaks in Manitoba slaughterhouses and meat processing facilities, none of which have resulted in shutdown. Bill 62 makes reference to the National Swine Farm Level Biosecurity Standard in defining biosecurity zones standards. And within this standard, there are some strategic objectives, and a couple of them I'll just mention here. One is to prevent for bioexclusion, so policies being developed to prevent the introduction of a pathogen to pigs, and also biocontainment, so strategies developed to prevent pathogens spreading from pigs. With respect to this, I'm curious about some of the response thus far, and I think this forms a very relevant context for this bill and addressing biosecurity issues in agriculture here in Manitoba. So I'll just make note of a couple incidences. In August 2020, Brandon's Maple Leaf Foods facility reported cases of COVID-19. The province maintained that there was no evidence of transmission within the facility and that the rise in cases was due to community spread, and thus the plant, the province allowed to remain open. However, there were 200 workers which circulated an open letter which stated that COVID cases at the plant are related to the facility's inability to ensure safe working conditions or to take workers seriously. And in addition to the power imbalance that exists between employee-employer, many of these workers are particularly vulnerable because they are temporary foreign workers. They don't have a permanent residency status, never mind citizenship status. But nonetheless, they spoke out to the experience of workers on the ground in these facilities. So when we're talking about supply chain accountability with respect to biosecurity, this is an important context to consider in looking at this bill and what's being targeted and maybe what's being missed here. In October through November 2020, Manitoba's Excelsior Poultry Processing Facility had approximately 76 confirmed COVID-19 cases. Now I'm based in rural Manitoba, so this is very close to where I live in southeastern Manitoba. And it's very concerning living near that, living near a lot of industrial agriculture facilities, be they intensive livestock operations or meat processing plants or slaughterhouses. Again, in this situation with Excelsior out in southeastern Manitoba, the province maintained there was no evidence of the virus spreading within the workplace and did not require the facility to close. But what we're seeing globally and certainly locally, looking into the US and parts of Canada, is there is an undeniable pattern between COVID-19 outbreaks and slaughterhouse facilities and meat packing facilities. We're seeing a lot of outbreaks in these workplaces in particular. There are currently outbreaks at 8 different meat processing plants in Alberta. Just a few examples. There are over 200 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Saskatoon at a processing facility there. And the University of Calgary, via their think tank Refugee Health YYC, has noted that Alberta's beef processing facilities have faced 2 of Canada's largest and most rapid COVID-19 outbreaks. So the question that really emerges from this context is that with outbreaks in such workplaces resulting in wide-scale transmission of COVID-19, why is the Manitoba government targeting whistleblowers in legislation that's alleged to be about biosecurity? These slaughterhouses and meat processing facilities right here in Manitoba share the same fundamental working conditions as those in both Canada and the US, which have experienced COVID outbreaks. And these similar and shared conditions are working in close proximity to others, so workers working closely to one another, fast production lines, and cool, dry environments, which apparently are scientifically shown to be optimal for respiratory virus transmission. So my concern with Bill 62 is that it effectively prevents whistleblowers from documenting the conditions of and interacting with animals in transport. The fact is that while livestock operations, slaughterhouses, and meat processing facilities are known vectors for the transmission of pathogens, citizens gathering roadside to give water to pigs or to document animal welfare conditions are not known vectors for pathogen transmission. And that's really what's at stake here. Listening earlier to members of the agricultural industry, I'm hearing that they do put a lot of time and care into biosecurity measures and that's something that's very important to them. However, there's still a failure to make any link between specifically pathogen transmission risk with people roadside documenting, as we heard earlier from some of the lawyers with respect to constitutional issues, the vagueness of the wording, interacting that could encompass simply taking photographs, basic documentation, even giving water aside. So these are things that are don't seem to be substantiated in this bill's reach. And looking again at the recent track record of biosecurity in agriculture with respect to the pandemic in this province, it's a very questionable context as to whether this bill is truly about biosecurity. And I think that's what we're really hearing tonight. So to echo what many others tonight have said, I think Bill 62 is not really fully about biosecurity, and that other measures would be taken, we'd be seeing elsewhere along supply chain for animal agriculture and the industry that have not been taken, as I mentioned earlier. So as a resident of rural Manitoba, I bear witness to animals in transport for slaughter regularly, oftentimes just incidentally while I'm driving down a highway near where I live. I witness these animals being transported in all weather conditions because, as has been mentioned earlier, there are no legal limits for temperatures or weather conditions within which animals cannot be transported. So I've witnessed animals being transported in unconscionable weather, minus 40 above and below, with the wind chill, and of course compounded by the wind chill created by the truck itself traveling at the speeds it's traveling down the highway. These are very concerning things that when I speak to family and friends, other Manitobans, most people are not aware of. And that's why I believe whistleblowing is so very important for this industry. So my partner and I personally have cared for hens which were rescued from slaughter. Family and friends were abhorred to see the state that these birds were in. They were rescued from a commercial egg farm. They had feathers missing on their wings, tail feathers missing, feathers missing along their throat. They came from what the industry refers to as conventional cages, which is a nice way of saying battery cages. In other words, living spaces so small they can barely open their wings, their feet constantly on a wire flooring, never really breathing fresh air, seeing the light of day until they're transported for slaughter, which again, there's not much regulating that. I've seen I think it's really important, like in talking with family and friends around the conditions of the birds, which was just evidently marked on their bodies, that it's so crucial that the public have access to this information about the truth of the conditions for farm animals. I know it's informed my choices going forward and other people that I speak with. The public has a right to access independent information about animal care and the food system, and not industry advertising and promotion that doesn't count. I've seen photo and video documentation taken in Manitoba thanks to whistleblowers, thanks to activists roadside. I appreciate that information. Pigs caught between two levels of a transport truck has been documented. You can imagine how excruciatingly painful that would be when they're traveling for up to 28 hours. I've seen photo and video documentation taken in Manitoba of animals frothing at the mouth, exhibiting signs of heat stroke and visibly in distress. And as people have noted, the CFIA acknowledges millions of animals arrive dead to slaughterhouses each year. And it's really no surprise because, as mentioned, there's no temperature or weather limits for transport. And the animals are also deliberately starved and denied water for a period of time before they're transported in order to reduce the mess in the trucks from their effluent. So these are all very horrid it's saying my connection's unstable. These are all very horrid conditions that much of the public does not know about. And I'm grateful to whistleblowers and people documenting these conditions so that I've been able to be informed.
Unfortunately, the time allotted for your presentation has expired. We will now move into questions.
Thank you.
The Honorable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Ms. Robertson, for your presentation. Thank you for staying with us so late in the evening, and appreciate your input.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Akelia, you had a really impressive talk. Thanks for the example you quoted. Thanks for your reflection about the government's track record while handling the pandemic, and your examples and your knowledge about what happened at Maple Leaf plant and so on. I'm really thankful for your inputs here. I would like to ask you this. How would Bill 62 look like if you get a chance to rewrite it?
Ms. Robertson.
Thank you. If I were to rewrite Bill 62, I would definitely take out the sections concerning interacting with animals in transport. Again, there are no scientifically documented vectors of transmission in those situations, but as mentioned earlier, there are several scientifically documented outbreaks due to the conditions that are really inherent in industrial agriculture. And that's exactly, as folks have mentioned, what whistleblowers seek to reveal. So I think that the fact that this bill, targets whistleblowers when they're not a known vector for pathogen transmission presents a massive unjustifiable overreach. And as others have mentioned tonight, limits the charter right to freedom of expression and association, and that's very problematic. If I were to rewrite it, I would take that out. I would also take out, the uncertainty around the wording of biosecurity zone. The bill itself references the Canadian Farm, the CFIA, as well as the National Swine Farm Level Biosecurity Standard, and that standard notes CAP, controlled access points, which could be anything. It's defined as any entry point through which traffic, people, livestock make their way into a controlled access zone or restricted access zone, such as a slaughterhouse or an intensive livestock operation. So that could really be any public space that's being defined as a controlled access point. And as this bill references the National Swine Farm Level Biosecurity Standard, that could then be interpreted as a biosecurity zone. So it's very vague. It creates a lot of issues there. So I would take that right out.
The Honourable Mr. Gerard.
Yes, thank you, Acalia, and appreciate your talk. What was it that got you interested in advocating for animals?
Ms. Robertson?
Thank you for the question. Well, I actually began working with women's legal education action type issues when I was younger, and then moved on to children and groups that are vulnerable, and animals are a group that is vulnerable. And it's kind of socially permissible to hate on vegans and animal rights activists in a way that it's not socially permissible to take up critique with folks who are combating racism and sexism and such in society. So I kind of see animals as that frontier that needs a little bit of advocacy. And also, animals enhance my life, and I have family members that are beyond human, and they should be represented.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for Ms. Robertson? Seeing no further questions, we thank you for your presentation, and we will now move on to the next presenter. I will now call on Carolina Valenzuela and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Ms. Valenzuela is not available right now, so we will drop her name to the bottom of the list. I will now call on Justin Renke, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Justin?
Hello.
You may proceed with your presentation when you're ready, Justin.
Hi. So just to clarify my last name, it's Rybuck. So I'll start my presentation. So yeah, I'm in opposition of Bill 62. I am an ex-slaughterhouse facility worker and an ex-factory farm worker with 6 years experience in factory farming. During my time in factory farming, I managed a 1,000 farrow to finish operation. As a breeder, I achieved the highest born alive record in Manitoba. In 2008, there was 24 born alive in one sow, and 24 went on to weaning. I also worked in chicken industry, catching chickens, where I was witness to workers overcrowding cages when loading for transport, broken legs and broken wings when carrying birds and putting them in cages for transport. Also, many birds are not able to walk due to the accelerated growth due to genetic manipulation over the last 50 years. My experience with these conditions of animals on farms and reasons why we need to be able to witness and photo animals in transportation on arrival to slaughter facilities. With pigs, I've witnessed severe bruising, scratching, prolapses, which I've provided a definition in my handout for the committee. Lame animals, which means leg injuries where they cannot walk properly. Gasping for air due to heat exhaustion in distress due to the conditions of the way they are transported in heat, as there's no rules and regulations for cold and hot weather. In the wintertime, we have animals frozen to the sides of transport trucks, legs falling through the cracks and arriving injured to the slaughter facilities. Swollen joints and unable to walk properly. Abscesses that are very large and should not have been shipped, as these are on their way to a facility for meat. And also cattle prod marks, and which is very noticeable when they've been cattle prodded in the face, because you can see their eyes are really red and their faces have intensive scratching. With chickens, we've encountered dead birds caused by heat and improper loading. They didn't space the birds out, so the middle birds often get overheated in hot temperatures, and the birds die in these transport trucks. In the winter, we have witnessed frozen birds due to not properly tarping in cold conditions below zero, which Animal Justice has filed complaints with the CFIA on Granny's Poultry, now Excelidor. When witnessing this, we saw bleeding skin, cracked, frozen, frostbitten skin, and dead birds with no feathers. There's bodies we have witnessed with birds that are in thunderstorms in the summertime. They transport them in thunderstorms without properly covering them up or stopping the transport trucks to not drive through thunderstorms. We photographed this. And also, we've also witnessed the animal chickens with their legs and wings stuck in the cages where the workers didn't take the time to remove the animal from that situation in distress. And on to biosecurity. I have provided references for the disease infection timeframe in my handout. For respiratory in pigs, we see that it takes 6 to 7 days for a respiratory illness to show signs in the animal. So if for biosecurity zones to work, they wouldn't work, because if activists were to be contaminated with one of these diseases, these animals would be killed in 12 to 24 hours anyways. So there would be no time for this disease to actually infect the animal. Also, with biosecurity in barns, when I worked in barns, I witnessed, as they talked about, we shower in and shower out. But what they don't talk about is those buildings are not airtight facilities with filtration systems. So we have mosquitoes, flies, and all kinds of spiders, bugs, mice going in and out of this barn, which does not go along with biosecurity, as they do not shower in and shower out, as they're insects. And if a mosquito were to bite a human outside, or fly into a barn and bite a pig, they could infect it. And same with any other insects and animals that could get into the barn, as I've seen birds even get into the barns. With chickens, I provided in my handout there, the 5 main forms of diseases. In severe pathogenic forms, there is a span of 3 to 4 days for most birds to show signs of infection. So once again, a biosecurity zone outside of a slaughter facility wouldn't do anything, because it takes 3 to 4 days for these infections to start in the birds. So the bird would already be killed. So once again, we are wasting time and money of our taxpayers' dollars. So protesters can scientifically not infect animals during transport outside of a slaughter facility. With transporting hogs, when I worked in the facilities, we would turn the food off 12 to 24 hours before shipping, as we wouldn't want excrement in the trailers, and for slaughter, as you wouldn't want poo all over your meat as it's killed. no water during shipping, obviously. There's no water in these transport trucks. So for extreme temperatures, we have witnessed many times animals gasping for air, in distress, in heat exhaustion. And we have to remember these animals arrive at a slaughter facility where lots of times they're stored for 12 hours before they're slaughtered. And most times they might not be getting the adequate care they need within that 12 time period. So with 28 hours of transport time, which is legal, plus 12 hours of being held in a slaughter facility before being killed, that animal is reaching 36 to 38 hours of no food or water. Would you do that to a dog or cat? And furthermore, 2 billion animals arrive dead at slaughterhouses on average every year. All vigil groups have safety protocol in place and forward it to proper authorities before doing vigils. Most and all vigils have designated safety person, and all wear safety vests. So these situations are done in a safe manner. And the driver doesn't need to be worrying about injuries to activists as we are more worried about our safety as well. There are laws in place to stop B&Es in barns, break and enters, as the other lawyers have all spoke on. So adding these extra measures is really just causing more legal battles for later on for our constitutional challenges, as there's laws in place already. So why are we adjusting laws that we already have? So in ending, as most of my points were already all spoken on, you can't make a law on something you have not witnessed or experienced yourself. So please educate yourselves and watch the link that I provided in your handout, Dominion Movement, to understand what goes on in these intensive factory farm facilities. So that's what I have to share with you guys today, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation. The Honorable Mr. Peterson.
Thanks, Justin, for staying with us for tonight and for your information, and I will look through your handout.
Thank you.
Mr. Brar.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Justin, for your powerful presentation, and your experience is valuable. It's first-hand experience, and you shared a lot of information that the members of the committee and the people who are listening might not know already. So do you still continue working in the same industry or not anymore?
Mr. Renicky.
No, I got out of the industry in 2009 and became a Red Seal bricklayer.
Mr. Gerard, are there any further questions?
Yes, I do have a question.
The Honorable Mr. Gerard.
Justin, thank you for your presentation. You provide a unique insight of the presenters today, of somebody who has worked inside animal facilities for a number of years and has now moved on from there. What was it that made you decide that there needed to be major changes in animal welfare in animal facilities?
Want me to go?
Mr. Renicky?
Yeah, just waiting for you. What got me to change was it took me a couple of years. I had a severe car accident in 2017 where I almost passed away. And I really just looked at my life in a different manner and wanted to be healthier for my kids, and realized the impact of animal agriculture on my health and what animal products do to our bodies. So it was a big health initiative first, and then I realized once I watched a couple documentaries that I was actually part of the problem as being one of these workers, and seeing what I was seeing in these documentaries was exactly what you will see in Manitoba factory farms. Everything you see in Dominion Movement happens in a Manitoba farm, and it can be closely related to some of the largest factory farms in the United States with what they've done to the environmental impact of Lake Winnipeg and the environmental impact of our rivers and streams, as the amount of manure that is poured onto these fields every year. And also what people don't realize is the amount of chemicals that are all used in cleaning these facilities is also put into the same pit with the manure and poo and dumped into our lakes. So countless chemicals like lime, degreasers, and disinfectants are added to the manure and poo, not to mention the medical waste from castration, tail clippings, and any other medical waste that might fall into the slats of these barns. So for me, it was just realizing the big environmental impact, health impact, and impact on every single animal that has to go through this process.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? We thank you for your presentation. Before we move on to the next presenter, being it's close to midnight, is it the will of the committee to continue the business at hand and finish it tonight, to sit after midnight? We have one, possibly two presenters, and then clause by clause. What is the will of the committee? It has been agreed to continue sitting past midnight until the business of this committee is completed. Agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed, and so ordered. We will now call on David Wiens, Chair of the Dairy Farmers of Manitoba. David, are you there?
Good evening, Mr. Chair.
Good evening, Mr. Wiens. You may proceed with your presentation.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, I'll just say a little bit about Dairy Farmers in Manitoba, and then I'll introduce myself a little bit more. Dairy Farmers in Manitoba represents 250 family dairy farms in Manitoba. We produce 410 million liters of milk every year. We create about just over 6,000 jobs in Manitoba, and that includes on-farm transportation of milk, dairy processing, and the service providers that we need on the farm. I would like to say too that last year, when the pandemic hit, it was a little bit of a volatile market in terms of milk consumption. But it was during that year that where we normally contribute 328,000 liters of milk to Manitoba Harvest. Last year, due to the circumstances that the food banks found themselves under, we increased that by another over 124,000 liters of milk to try to reach out to those who were less fortunate than many of us are. So, so we're able to contribute in that respect. So I would like to say a little bit about myself. So I'm a third generation dairy farmer. I farm together with my brother and our families. I've been born on the dairy farm, and I've spent all my life caring for cows, and so I've always been there. So that has been my life, and I can definitely speak to that. One of the things that we've done in the dairy industry, and this is, we've created an assurance program. We call it ProAction, and every dairy farm in Canada has to abide by it. So it includes a number of different modules, and one is food safety. So we have developed food safety systems on the farm to ensure that the milk remains safe throughout the process. We have CFIA approval for that. We also have another module of this program is milk quality. And the third one is animal care. And the animal care, our animal care module in our assurance program is based on the code of practice for dairy cattle, and it was developed together with dairy farmers, with veterinarians, with Humane Canada has been involved in that process. Veterinarians have been involved. We've had we've had the consumer representation as well as retailers. So we've had many stakeholders that were part of the development of the code. And once it had been developed, then all the requirements were taken into our pro action. And so farms are audited every year to ensure that all of these things are actually being followed. There's also the traceability that is part of our program, and that traces an animal from the time it's born until the time it leaves the farm. Biosecurity is another important element of this program, and of course, and finally, environment. And so all of these things are being audited on farms by independent auditors. And so if a farm for any reason would fall out of compliance, ultimately they would be forced to close down. So there is a very close oversight on those farms in terms of so we have worked closely on our animal care component. For example, we've worked very closely with the National Farm Animal Care Council as well. So that kind of talks a little bit about the kind of oversight that we have on dairy farms. And so as we as you know, this legislation was starting to be developed, and through consultation, certainly we are supportive of the legislation here, both from the trespassing portion of it, but it's all tied into with the animal disease as well, and the concerns that we have around that. So we've begun to see that where there have been at first this was something that we would see in the U.S., but we've increasingly seen that in Canada, where we do have people who will storm onto the farms and try to create havoc there for the farms. And these cows are looked after. We look, for example, our barns today are built with maximum cow comfort in mind. For example, in my barn, we have special rubberized flooring for comfort. We've got foot baths. We've got a big grooming brush, self-activated grooming brushes that cows can tend to whenever they want, and the milking system where they can be milked on their own schedule. And so the focus is on cow comfort. One of the things you would have to know about cows is that they are also they're sensitive animals. They recognize the caregivers that are with them every day, and they can be agitated if you would suddenly have strangers come storming into the barn, because that is something that they don't know, they don't recognize. And certainly from a disease perspective, should get back to the biosecurity element of our assurance program, and that is to prevent disease from coming onto the farm. And if you have something on the farm, to try to keep it on the farm and not let it get off. And of course, trying to prevent the spread of it on the farm is critical. And so it becomes what then is very critical then is that there are some diseases that are easily transferred, from off the farm onto the farm. And there is through our biosecurity, each one of us works with our veterinarians to establish a program that we're going to follow on the farm in terms of a vaccination program, and in terms of how we can manage any kind of a disease on the farm, and also obviously how to prevent. And that's the key, is to try to prevent this from ever coming, different diseases from ever coming onto the farm. So that is done in consultation with a vet. And so when people want to come onto the farms, that is done with permission ahead of time. Arrangements are being made, And of course, then all the necessary precautions can be taken so that people don't inadvertently bring some kind of, disease or those kind of things onto the farm and affect the cows. So we are very careful of those kind of things. It's very important to our program. And again, we see this more in Canada, where there is people bursting onto the farm and creating havoc that way. We are, and of course, it's not only the concern for people that that come on. It doesn't matter who they are, whether they're protesters or whether there's somebody that's coming on for any other reason. To simply have them come on and come into the facility or come into where we're housing cattle outside is a risk. And of course, this comes back to the point of actually taking care of these animals and looking after for the best welfare outcome for our animals. And so we strongly support this legislation, which is actually the timing of it fits very well with our program. Our biosecurity component in our program just came into effect a year ago. And so what we had is a little bit of a weakness in terms of what the status quo is right now in the province. So we certainly look forward to to the kind of support that this legislation can give something that we're doing in terms of providing our animals with the best care possible. And so really, I would just as soon leave more time for.
Unfortunately, Mr. Wiens, the time has ran out for your presentation, so we will now move into questions. The Honourable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, David, for your information on how biosecurity and the effects that or the dairy business, how it would be affected by people that, when knowingly or unknowingly, could affect your operation. But also thank you for the donations of Manitoba dairy farmers to the food banks. I know it was both in terms of milk products and cheese products. To those who were in need in the early days of the COVID outbreak, I know you do it every year, but there was extra this year. So thank you very much for those donations.
Thank you.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wiens, thank you so much for what you're doing for all of us, and thanks for putting food on our table even during the pandemic. Really appreciate that. Just curious to know about two things. I understand you require two things for your animals, which is veterinary services and veterinary extension information services. So how and where do you seek that service from?
Mr. Wiens?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So on every dairy farm, the farmer works with a veterinarian on an ongoing basis. So we have the same veterinarian come into our operation at least once every 2 weeks. We walk through the herd, we review, and we have checks that we do from one visit to the next. So it's an ongoing thing. So that discussion with the veterinarian, and then of course, and sometimes there's going to be for farmers, they will have workshops and things where veterinarians and other professionals and researchers can present information to us on which we can continue to build better protocols.
The Honourable Mr. Gerard, did you have a question now?
Yes, I sure do. Thank you, David. You really took us through quite carefully aspects of your dairy operation, and thank you. My question deals with, how things have evolved over, say, the last 20 or 30 years. At the moment, you're now at a position where you're much more concerned and much more active in terms of biosecurity than you would have been a couple of decades ago. Can you just give us a perspective on how that's evolved?
Mr. Wiens.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Just in terms of, for example, on our farm, there used to be a time when we would, buy, heifers, and introduce them into the herd. And they were simply brought in and joined the rest of the herd. Well, now, first of all, on our farm, we no longer bring new animals onto the farm. We're very careful with that. We don't want to take the risk of introducing anything that we don't have onto the farm. And it is, when that, it can happen where, let's say you bring in a group of animals and they can bring in a respiratory disease, for example, that you don't have, and you pay for it dearly. So, and even now, when they're brought in, those farms that may want to bring in some new animals, they will be quarantined for a period of time just to ensure that they're healthy, that there wasn't anything that was unseen when they came in. So those, so that's on the animal side, and then on the people side, there used to be a lot less oversight in terms of the people coming on onto the farm, walking into the barn. It was not a big deal. Well, now it is. You don't walk in without permission. You don't come into the property without permission. And it's not about being unfriendly. I mean, absolutely. For those who are concerned about animal care, we are too. It matters to us a lot, and so that's why we have developed this program, to ensure that this happens consistently across the farms.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Wiens. We will now move on to our next presenter. I will now call Carolina Valenzuela and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Carolina is not available. She will be struck from the list. That concludes the list of presenters I have before me. In what order does the committee wish to proceed with clause-by-clause consideration of these bills? The Honourable Mr. Peterson.
We should probably do Bill 36 first, followed by Bill 62.
Is it agreed that we will go numerically? Agreed and so ordered? We will now proceed with clause by clause of Bill 36. Does the minister responsible for Bill 36 have an opening statement? The Honourable Mr. Peterson.
Very quickly here, Mr. Chairman. Bill 36 clarifies that food safety is a public health issue. The bill enhances public health by making it clear that no one can sell or distribute food that is unfit for human consumption, updating and clarifying inspection powers, and expanding the ability to seize unsafe food. The previous government passed a law in 2009 to separate the regulation of food into two statutes, but then did not proclaim the Food Safety Act, and therefore that act is being repealed. Rather than using two different provincial legislation frameworks would only serve to confuse the public and create additional red tape for business, this bill repeals the Food Safety Act and ensures that food safety will continue to be dealt with under one framework, the Public Health Act. And we will be launching consultations and engaging with food processors, restaurants, direct farm marketers, retailers, consumers, and the public as we move to modernize and improve food safety regulations under the Public Health Act. And so I look forward to debate of this bill.
We thank the minister for his statement. Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank you all, the Manitoba producers, especially small farmers, who continue to put food on our table. Regarding Bill 36, it amends the Public Health Act to deal with food safety by establishing a duty to serve safe food, expanding powers to seize unsafe food, clarifying inspection powers related to food, and expanding regulations making powers for starting and operating a food establishment. Currently, the information about a disease presenting a public health threat must, on request, be provided to the Chief Public Health Officer. The Act is amended to expand the obligation to provide information about a contaminant as well. So the definition contaminated is clarified by limiting its application to humans. All Manitobans deserve food that is safe, affordable, convenient to access, and culturally appropriate. Manitobans rely on government and regulators to ensure the food they consume is safe to eat. When food safety is not protected, or when things fall through the cracks, people can become seriously ill or die as a result. There are numerous diseases affecting both humans and animals that can result from unsafe food or food handling practices. Unfortunately, the Auditor General recently found that province of Manitoba is not adequately prepared for an animal disease emergency. The AG also found that the Department of Agriculture did not have plans in place for recovering from an animal disease emergency, nor did they do assessments to determine the equipment, supplies, and personnel the province would need to respond to an animal disease emergency. The AG found that the province had identified several diseases of concern, but that the Department of Agriculture did not have a plan in place to deal with potential outbreaks of these diseases. Food safety is intricately linked to food security. Many Manitobans in northern regions and urban food deserts are currently struggling to access safe and affordable food. We believe this government should make addressing food security a priority and ensure that all Manitobans, regardless of where they live, can access safe, affordable, and culturally appropriate foods. Food is a human right. We believe all Manitobans should be secure when it comes to food. We will continue to call on the government to promote safe food practices, prepare for possible outbreaks of foodborne illnesses, and make healthy food affordable for all Manitobans. I'd like to thank all the presenters for providing their valuable input on Bill 36, and I hope that the Minister will listen to feedback from Manitobans and take the necessary steps to protect our food sources for future generations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We thank the member for that statement. During the consideration of a bill, the enacting clause and the title are postponed until all other clauses have been considered in their proper order. Also, if there is agreement from the committee, the chair will call clauses in blocks that conform to pages, with the understanding that we will stop at any particular clause or clauses where members have comments, questions, or amendments to propose. Is that agreed? Agreed. Agreed and so ordered. Shall clauses 1 and 2 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 1 and 2 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 3 and 4 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 3 and 4 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 5 through 8 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 5 through 8 are accordingly passed. Shall clause 9 pass?
Pass.
Clause 9 is accordingly passed. Shall clause 10 pass?
Pass.
Clause 10 is accordingly passed. Shall clauses 11 through 13 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 11 through 13 are accordingly passed. Shall the enacting clause pass?
Pass.
The enacting clause is accordingly passed. Shall the title pass? The title is accordingly passed. Shall the bill be reported? Agreed. The bill shall be reported. We will now move on to Bill 62, clause by clause. Does the minister responsible for Bill 62 have an opening statement? The Honourable Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the Government of Manitoba supports the rights of all Manitobans to hold and express their own views and beliefs. That does not extend, though, to trespassing onto private property where farm families live. And we've heard tonight about the stringent animal health and safety standards that our producers carry out each and every day. And the Government of Manitoba will not tolerate illegal activities that risk the safety of farm families or their livestock. Farms are not only places of business, they are homes where children and families also reside, and trespassing on these homes and places of work is a very serious matter. Trespassing can expose farms and food production facilities to biosecurity risks that could spread disease and may cause injury or stress to animals. And if a person interferes with an animal in transport, it can cause distress to the animals and impair the biosecurity of the entire trailer. And in addition, as we've heard tonight, it can cause a safety issue for the driver of the truck and for the activists involved in the action. We have seen the effects of trespassing in other jurisdictions, and so we are being proactive here to help the farm community and the public receive safe and wholesome food. And our objective is to have the legislation that protects our farmers in a way that will lead to a more safe, just, and peaceful Manitoba, and recognizes that there are areas where biosecurity needs to be protected. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We thank the minister for that statement. Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Brar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I welcome everyone for taking time to participate in the committee today. Many Manitobans have reached out to me to share their thoughts on Bill 62. I thank you all for your inputs. Thanks to the farmers' organizations, citizens, animal rights organizations for reaching out and putting some important information forward on the subject of human rights, animal rights, citizen rights, food security, and biosecurity. It's important that we all work together to help our governments frame legislations that defend our rights, improve our processes, and build a positive, inclusive, tolerant, and friendly society that we all wish to live in. We all want safety in our food system, but we have real concern about the intent of this legislation. I served for many years in rural Manitoba with Manitoba Agriculture and Rural Development. It was then called, now it's called Department of Agriculture and Resource Development. I know how serious the threats of disease are to our food system. I will never forget the tragic consequence that bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, that we call, had in Manitoba, and I share serious concern about other threats such as African swine fever, foot and mouth, and avian influenza. Food safety and disease outbreak is a matter I have had opportunity to question the Pallister government about here at the Manitoba legislature, and I look forward to continuing to serve producers and the public in this regard. This bill creates a new classification of offense for entering into zones marked as biosecure and defines as a breach any hindrance or obstruction of a vehicle carrying animals in transport. Our role as legislatures is to consider the needs of our community and the right of individuals. We must weigh the curtailment of an individual's right. Bill 62 would see Manitobans fined up to $10,000 for doing something as simple as give water to dehydrated animals on the way to slaughter. The broadness of this bill raises legitimate question as to whether the bill might withstand charter challenge. It does not serve the public if legislation is put forward only to be struck down. I'd like to thank all the presenters for bringing forward their valuable input on Bill 62. I hope the minister will listen to Manitobans. Thank you.
We thank the member for his statement. During the consideration of a bill, the enacting clause and the title are postponed until all other clauses have been considered in their proper order. Also, if there is agreement from the committee, the chair will call clauses in blocks that conform to pages, with the understanding we will stop at any particular clause or clauses where members may have comments, questions, or amendments to propose. Is that agreed? Agreed and so ordered. Shall clauses 1 and 2 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 1 and 2 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 3 and 4 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 3 and 4 are accordingly passed. Shall clause 5 pass?
Pass.
Clause 5 is accordingly passed. Shall clauses 6 and 7 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 6 and 7 are accordingly passed. Shall the enacting clause pass?
Pass.
The enacting clause is accordingly passed. Shall the title pass?
Pass.
The title is accordingly passed. Shall the bill be reported?
Agreed.
Agreed. The bill shall be reported. The hour being 12:17, what is the will of the committee? Committee rise.